Hey everybody, there are now two platforms that just made it incredibly easy to provide a paid MCP server to customers without the need for them to install a thing. Smithery and Cloudflare have both solved the hosting problem that kept MCP servers trapped on localhost. And now the door is wide open to launch a server that can be accessed by an LLM. I'll show you exactly how both platforms work and help you pick the perfect one for your business. Just a couple of weeks ago, there was a flood of announcements for support for remote MCP servers from Claude Code to Gemini CLI and even OpenAI. Support for remote MCP and LLM clients is huge because it's eliminated the biggest roadblock to a profitable business built on MCP, getting users to download, install, and run your server. The fact that you don't have to do that anymore just opens the door to new revenue models for MCP that didn't really make sense before. For example, you can now provide direct services to customers from your MCP server during their day-to-day interactions with the LLM client of their choice. Users can now connect to your MCP server with a single URL, the same way they might visit your service from a browser. That means existing monetization models become pretty interesting for MCP services, like subscription-based MCP service, usage-based pricing models, enterprise integrations, custom solutions, and even marketplace distribution and discovery. Next, I'm going to show you two platforms that you can use today to deploy a paid MCP server in minutes. All right, so the first platform we're going to talk about today is Smithery. And as you can see right here, you can tell that this is a little bit more than just a platform for deployment of MCPs. It's also a directory of MCP services. So if we scroll through some of the featured MCP servers right here, you'll probably recognize some existing tools that you might be using. We've got Google Maps, Notion, and HubSpot. There's also some search tools down here. So they've got over 7,000 tools that can be called from these different services. Yeah, there's a lot to choose from. So let's just go ahead and pick search right here. And so from this page, you get a little bit more detail about the particular server. You can see all the clients that are supported. If we scroll down this list there, it makes it really easy to integrate this MCP server with any of your existing LLM clients. It makes it really easy for users to find you and then to use that tool. And then one other thing you can do right here, built in the Smithery, is they have their own playground. So if we open that up, I will approve connecting. And we can actually just try it right here. So X is a search tool, MCP server. So let's go ahead and do a search for the latest news. And you can see there's our request to the MCP servers with our query. And there we have our answer. Okay, so you might have noticed in the previous demo that we didn't have to pay for any of those services. So let me show you an example, since this is a video about how to monetize these services, how one of these other services works. Taking a look at Notion here, let's open that up and we will try this in the playground. And let me just switch users real quick and we'll connect to the server. And there we are. So at this point we have a notification that we're required to enter our Notion API key, which it gives me a nice link right here so I can go over and create an integration API key. So this is, and we can actually go back here and let me switch my profile, which I'll talk about in a second, and refresh this. And let's reconnect to Notion. And let's list our databases. And we're going to connect again. And so this time it succeeds. It's able to connect to Notion. That's because Smithery has this idea of profiles. So you control your access to the different servers via API keys that are entered via these different connections. So if we open our optional settings down here, let's go down to Notion. You can see right there, we've got the API key that is required to use this service. So that kind of gives you an idea of the approach. And this is going to be a little bit different from the next service that we're going to talk about, and there are different approaches to monetization and gating user access, because it wouldn't really make sense to have a public Notion. You can have a public Notion page that's accessible online, but you don't want somebody logging into your account and doing things. So the Notion API key obviously makes sense here in order to access my protected resources. And this is really a model that you can use for your own services now, that rather than needing to install this locally and do any type of additional setup. In order to access my private data on Notion, I just require a single API key, and I can easily integrate with it that way. And the same thing goes for if we're to connect to another LLM client as well. Smithery makes it very simple to connect because of the remote MCP access here. If we're to go to something like, so if I generate a URL for Notion, you can see I can select between my different profiles. My personal profile has the Notion API key. So when I go to get the link, it's going to generate a unique link for me that I can actually use with my API key embedded with access to the profile. So I can then go and use this on another LLM client directly without needing to install anything locally. So let's take a look at what it takes to connect my Smithery Notion MCP to my Claude AI chat right here. So all we need to do is go to add integration. I can give it any name. Let's just call it Notion, and then paste my URL in there. And then I can go ahead and add that. And now you can see under integrations, I have Notion, and I can make the same query that I did within the Notion sandbox right here in Claude. So let's say, please list my Notion DBs. And you can see here it's calling the list databases tool on the Notion MCP. We'll go ahead and allow. And there we are. There's my different Notion databases, I guess you would call them. All right, so here we are back on the main page. What other thing I wanted to show, how do we actually deploy our own MCP server? So you'll notice the button up in the upper right-hand corner that just says deploy server. And there's a little bit of information here about how you'll do that. And it actually might seem unreal, but it's actually this easy to go ahead and get started with your own server. So a little bit about the way Smithery works is you do the development locally. So we'll open up a new cursor project in a second, run these commands. We can test it locally. We'll be able to use the Smithery playground to do that testing locally. And then we can connect this up to GitHub, and Smithery will handle the deployment, building our Docker container, deploying it to their own server. And whenever we push to main, Smithery will go ahead and redeploy the server again for us. So one important aspect of this is that Smithery runs on public repos. So one doesn't mean that you can't monetize it, but it does mean that there's a little bit of additional steps involved to getting to that monetization. So we'll talk about that in a minute, but before we get into that, I just wanted to show you how that works. So we've already copied this command. Let me switch over to cursor here. So I've already created a new project. This is a completely empty file, and we'll just go ahead and install their example application, and that'll set up our whole TypeScript project for us. So you can see it's created some of the basic files here. It's installed our dependencies. And so this is an extremely basic server, but gets you the idea of how this works. It's probably the easiest to show. I'm going to show you an example of a little bit slightly more complex project in a minute, but just to show how everything works. So this is a very simple one file server, really. You can see we have a tool added here, server add tool. And basically all this is going to do is print out, return the contents, hello, and your name. So the next step, we switch back over to our instructions here. There we go. All right. And when it succeeds, opens up the new window right here for us. And you can see we're back in that original playground that we're using earlier. This is still hosted on Smithery.ai. So one aspect of Smithery that's interesting is that if you look at the server tool, so it returns server and is exporting this create stateless server function, it does import and use the MCP server class from the actual kind of base model context protocol, the TypeScript SDK from Anthropic itself, but it wraps all this. If we look at our package, what's actually being run here is this Smithery CLI tool. So we're like hosted within the Smithery CLI tool, and it's doing some of the heavy lifting for us to make this even simpler. It sets up in Grok for us to proxy locally so that we can use their hosted playground right here. And so there is one other kind of aspect of this to be aware of, is that because in Smithery in particular, all of your MCP servers need to be hosted on a public repo, this is very easy to get around just based on the fact that a user could download it and then run it, and then there goes your gate. This particular example still works because you can also gate API access. So all of your tools will be available and show as available to the user. But if you have APIs that you need to call, you can put your tools behind a Lambda function, for example, that requires API access. And so then you would just pass your key through there. One of the advantages of MCP now that it's remote is that you actually can have a private MCP server. Smithery doesn't support that, but the next platform that we're going to talk about does allow you to have a fully private MCP server, so that this opens up some additional types of gating that you can use. But the fact that you can easily add an API key here and then have that filter down to your particular service does still make it very easy because of the fact that Smithery also manages the keys for you. If we go over to my profiles, we can see the different MCP servers that I've configured so far and my API keys that would be associated with that. All track down into the server from my profile. And so when I go to actually use the MCP server, I'm just connecting via this URL here that gets surfaced here. But they have a kind of wrapper key. And so you have one URL, one link that you can use. Here, I'll just go ahead and click that to access the server, and it'll wrap, say you need 4 or 5 different API keys to access this particular MCP server because you're using multiple services. They all get wrapped into this one URL, gets passed down, and Smithery handles the authentication for you. So in that sense, depending on your goal and how you want to use it, Smithery can be a very simple solution for you, especially if you're planning on having your MCP server be public anyway. All right, so just to wrap up on Smithery, some of the advantages to Smithery are very simple deployment. If you use the example that I showed you right there and you use their existing tooling, you'll be able to build in Docker. They'll actually do the building for you if you don't want to build locally, but it's good to test there first. Once you have it deployed to GitHub, they'll monitor that. You connect it up to GitHub, and then anytime you push the main, they will deploy it. Very simple, easy to use, very fast deployments. There's built-in user management, which is nice. As we saw, the API key interface is managed on users can have multiple profiles linking to the MCP server. There's not any local setup involved. There's not a complex configuration. It's a simple one URL that contains both the URL to the MCP server, and it contains their configuration profile with all of their API keys. Also, in addition to being a hosting service, it's also a marketplace. So it's great for customers to be able to find you and use the playground all in one place. It seems to be one of the more popular directories. So hosting there is the only way to get listed in the directory for now. I talked on the Discord channel that they're going to be opening up to external repos and external MCP servers soon. But for now, in order to actually get listed on the Smithery.ai directory, you'll have to also deploy your server there, which gets into some of the downsides, which we've already talked about a few times. The fact that your MCP server code will need to be public doesn't mean that the APIs that you call have to be public. You can still use API keys to pass that through. So if you're looking to try something quickly, to iterate on an idea, Smithery is going to be one of your best options for very simply and easily integrating some simple gating to your APIs and to be able to build and iterate quickly. If you've got a new idea and you want to test it, that's a great place to do that. And you have monetization opportunities via gating, via API key. It's really the main option. There's a couple of different ways that you can do that. Smithery does suggest that you make all of your tools available at runtime, so users will be able to see all tools. But as they're using your MCP server, if there are particular tools that you need to have gated because they cost you money, for example, and you want to charge for those tools, at the time that they invoke that tool, showing a message like we saw earlier, throwing an error that if you're not passing through the correct API key, then you won't have access to that tool. And you can also, as we said, gate that at your API level. All right, so next off, the next platform we're going to show off here is Cloudflare. And so Cloudflare, right away you can see this isn't just an MCP platform. It's a full hosting platform like AWS or GCP, Azure. While they aren't fully focused on MCP, it is one of the better MCP providers right now. Cloudflare actually has a lot of AI tools and nice integrations. And because of the fact that they don't just host MCPs, it is a full developer platform. So you'll have access to databases, queuing, key value stores, additional functions and workers, all integrated into one platform. They also manage DNS for you, where Smithery would require you to use a non kind of white label URL. It's always going to have Smithery.ai in the URL for your MCP. With Cloudflare, you have the option to set up your own DNS. It's just that your MCP ends up being just another Cloudflare worker, which you can connect up to your DNS and your own domain name and white label it exactly. So Cloudflare did release support for remote MCP servers. They announced it in a blog post about a month ago. There's a lot of information in here about their process and how exactly they support it and some of the additional abstractions that they've put in place to support MCP and make it very easy for you to implement if you just want to vibe code this. So where we're going to start with this, if you just go to the Cloudflare AI GitHub repo, they actually have a lot of information in here. So this is the main repo. They have a lot of projects. If you go into demos, there's some kind of sub-projects in here where they have a lot of fully implemented working examples for you. So each one of these folders in here contains a full project. Lots of these are MCP. There's some image generation things as well in here, but you'll see a lot of different MCP servers that you can grab and implement. And this is very useful for authentication and for gating your MCP because they have examples already built for different authentication frameworks like Auth0, Authless, Authkit, GitHub OAuth, Google OAuth. And so what I want to show today is the implementation with GitHub OAuth. Like I said, there's a full README, so you can go through the whole process here. I've already pulled everything down and got it set up, so we can jump straight into that. This is very easy to set up. An LLM should be able to one-shot this for you if you're in Cursor. So here we are over in Cursor. I've pulled the remote MCP GitHub OAuth project down here and made some updates to it. And so we, just like in the Smithery example that we saw earlier, it is using the Model Context Protocol Server MCP as the base here. And so you can see this looks very similar to what we implemented there. However, instead of, if you go to the package file and you look at how we're actually running this, if you were to run it locally, we're using Wrangler as so here we're using Wrangler as the testing harness here. So if we were to run npm run dev, that's going to invoke Wrangler in the same way that you would run a Cloudflare worker. All right, so heading back over to the index, you can see they've implemented 3 different tools for us here. So there's a add tool, which takes in 2 different numbers, A and B, and then just runs a very simple JavaScript addition function there and returns that as a string. And then we have another tool, which is going to actually use the GitHub OctoKit to read the access token when we authenticate to the server and return the information about that user. And then this is an interesting aspect to this, is that this also shows some gating functionality where once you have authentication credentials for the user, we know what their username is. We can also surface tools dynamically to a user based on their username. And so that's what's actually happening here, as I have a list up at the top. I've included my name, my GitHub username as in the list of allowed usernames. While we're booting up this function and the init, it's actually going to, before it actually surfaces that tool, it'll actually check to see if we're allowed to use this tool or not. And because Cloudflare allows you to host MCP servers privately, so all of your code will remain private, you'll be the only one who has access to this. This is actually an actual way to gate access to certain tools within your MCP server that you don't want users to have access to without, for example, paying for an API or for paying for your service. And then one other aspect to this, you can see everything is wrapped in this OAuth provider. So this is something that Cloudflare has provided for us. Yep. So this comes from the OAuth workers OAuth provider. This is an addition from Cloudflare that allows us to very easily set up the requirements for OAuth and to implement this. And so this application kind of runs through this example application runs through the whole process of OAuth integration with GitHub OAuth. I've already set up a GitHub OAuth application on GitHub. The README goes through all of that if you want to try that yourself. And each one of the READMEs, because Cloudflare does support multiple, there may not be an example for it, but any application framework that supports OAuth, you'll be able to implement here as well. I have also implemented this for Clerk for my own projects. If you're interested in seeing that, I've been planning to put up a pull request to include that for Cloudflare. But if you're interested, I'd be happy to share that. So we can go ahead and run this. All right, and so there's two things I want to show you here. Because we actually can run this locally, you'll see it's just running on localhost 8788 here. I'm also going to spin up the Context Protocol testing tool here, or the inspector. And so I have this running locally now. So I've got the inspector running locally, and we have the MCP server running locally. So we're running the MCP server at 8788. So this looks a little bit different because this is than what we saw with Smithery, which was a fully wrapped and implemented AI playground. Here, where this MCP inspector is literally only for calling tools and for testing directly with the MCP server. So the first thing, it helps get a little bit closer. You don't have the AI in between you and the MCP server. We're talking directly to the MCP server here, which helps a lot with debugging and tracking down issues. So I wanted to show this first just as an example. I haven't found a way to use this with Smithery yet because it wraps everything in ngrok so that they can use it send you directly to their playground. But this is the way that I've worked with it with Cloudflare, and Cloudflare also has a playground, which I'll show you next. All right, so we'll test this OAuth flow by just clicking Quick OAuth Flow. And so this page, you can see right here, is being hosted from locally. So this is a page that you can fully customize within your own code. So we'll go ahead and hit Approve. That will send us to GitHub servers to validate and then come back. And so that's been authenticated. And so from here, we want to make sure that the transport type is set to SSE because that's the only one that Cloudflare supports. And then if we connect, I also need to change this to SSE. So before we can connect to the server, we'll have to include our access token. So I'll grab that. And so now at the top here, we'll see in addition to auth, we have some tools available. If we go and list our tools, you'll see those 3 tools that I listed earlier. And let's update one thing real quick. So when I authenticated, actually let's take a look at that. If I click into user info kit, run this tool, you'll see my specific user information because I've already authenticated through GitHub. And so we should see there's my data right here. So it's got my login username, and this has been authenticated by GitHub. So at this point, we know this is definitely the user that we expect it to be. There's some different information about myself, avatar URL. So this is all information that you can use in your MCP server. And then you can also, the most important thing, once you know their login info, you might also want to use the ID, depending on how your application works. That's what we're using to gate access to the generate image tool. And because this does actually call an AI image generation LM tool on Cloudflare, and it's actually a very simple integration. One of the nice things about doing this with Cloudflare is because it is so simple. You can see where we gated access here by here's the array of users, and this can be obviously dynamic. This is for example purposes. You're not going to want to hard code your list of users that should have access. So you want to integrate this with your own OAuth flow. And so if we go back down here, actually let me comment out my own name and change this to another user. Now when we reload, let's clear the tools and list the tools again. When it makes that additional call, you can see now I no longer have access to the image generation tool. So that's how you would interact with Cloudflare via this very basic MCP inspector tool. Next, let's transition over to the playground, which Cloudflare has set up for us, which is very similar to the Smithery playground, just once again with a lot more options. The AI that we're interacting with, we have a lot more options here. We can use DeepSeek, Falcon, Gemma, all these open source models are all available through here. These are all models that Cloudflare is hosting already. So for here, in the same way that we added our MCP server URL, we'll just pull that over to here. And once again, make sure it's set to SSE. And when we connect here, we immediately, and this would be the experience that's going to be similar to interacting with this on Claude or another LLM client, is that it will immediately return a 401 when it sees that you don't have access. And then you can authenticate from there. So we'll authenticate with GitHub. I've already authenticated, so that was very fast. Oops. All right, and so when you're selecting a model, make sure you've selected a model that supports tool calling. The Llama 4 Scout Instruct model should have access to tool calling. So let's ask it to call one of our tools. And there we are. So you can see some of the info, some of the logs that went out when we made the tool call, and then here's the response. And once again, this is the AI kind of intercepting the information and surfacing a limited set of that information to us. So ultimately, the prompts that you're using in your MCP server and the model that the user is using to interact with are going to be important in returning the actual information that you want. All right, so one more thing related to white labeling, which I mentioned earlier. Your MCP server is just a worker. There's a little bit, because it's hosted on Cloudflare, it has access to the bindings that I showed you. And so there's a key value store that's associated with the OAuth. And if you read their blog post about it, you'll see a lot of the work that's gone into simplifying it for you. But you can think of it still as just a worker. And so if we switch over here, you'll see here's the MCP server that we've been calling. This just shows up in the compute workers. You see the same information you would about any other worker here. Your deployments, the different bindings, some logs, and which is another thing to keep in mind about Smithery as well, is that they do have a logs option. It looks like it's in beta. I don't have access to it. It looks like it is coming soon though, but right now you're not able to see the actual server logs from Smithery, unlike with Cloudflare. And then moving over to the domains and routes here, you can see right now I'm connecting to it on workers. I'm actually connecting locally. I forgot to connect. So you can see right here, we actually have I've deployed this, so it is being hosted. So if we actually switch back over to the playground and I replace where I was calling localhost here, and let's disconnect from this server, and I replace that with my deployed MCP, and connect. So you can see it's connected. I'm already authenticated. We've got our different tools here. I didn't make the update in the deployed server to remove my username, so I have my generate image tool back again. So I'm connecting to it via this domain name, but I can easily add my own custom domain route from one of my existing zones here that I already have set up very easily, just the way you would any other worker. So this opens up a lot of avenues for enterprise clients, for example, that might want a white label solution for an MCP server you might build. It gives you the ability to do that, more custom routing. So let's talk about some of the advantages of Cloudflare. If you are say you have an existing SaaS application and you're looking to expand into MCP, Cloudflare is going to be a great option for you because it gives you more options. There's an opportunity to implement OAuth authentication, so your customers wouldn't need an additional API key. They can authenticate the same way they would into your website. Also, the ability to deploy private MCP servers with white label URLs makes it a great option if you have an existing service. Cloudflare prices are also extremely competitive to other providers like AWS or GCP, and because you're just paying for a worker, which is an ephemeral service, you're only paying for the time that the function is actually running and serving traffic. That helps keep costs down a lot. Also, because Cloudflare is a large-scale provider, you'll have enterprise-grade security and clear SLAs. If you really care about uptime, this is an important service for you, Cloudflare is definitely going to be the way you want to go. And as far as monetization options, you have multiple options because of the fact that, once again, it's a private MCP server, which means you can implement tools directly on the MCP server. That might be brand new tools that you want to try. They might be specific to an LLM that you don't already have on an existing server. You can implement them directly on the MCP and deploy that, keep the code private, and charge customers for that via authenticated access. You also have the option for an enterprise licensing deal if that's something you're interested in, because of the fact that you can spin up these servers and then connect them to a domain very easily through Cloudflare's existing DNS service. Okay, so let's break down the options that we looked at real quick. So first we looked at Smithery, which is a great option for your MCP if you're looking for really broad market appeal and you want to move really fast, because it's got the combination of the directory service as well as the actual hosting. And also, because of the fact that it's free, there's really very few blockers to you for trying out a couple of different things and seeing what works best for you. There's really no downside to it. And there's a little bit less complexity to set up. So if you don't want some of the additional configurations and you're okay with having your code be public, at least on the specifically on the MCP side, then Smithery is going to be a great option. On the Cloudflare side, it's obviously a lot of upside for enterprise customers or for existing SaaS applications that want to expand in the MCP. If you've got a lot of ideas for some more complexity that you'd like to add into your MCP directly there, you'll have a lot of access to AI tools, databases, caching, queues, all the things that come with Cloudflare will be easily available in your MCP service. You'll be able to whitelist your MCP and use OAuth authentication, which is a big upside. Additionally, keeping your code private is going to be huge for a lot of people, and Cloudflare has done a lot of work to really make the process very simple. So ultimately, Cloudflare is a great option, whether or not you're extremely technical. Setting up one of these MCP servers with authentication, because there are examples already for you. If you want to vibe code it, I would not see a problem. You could probably one-shot a lot of these changes and implement your own MCP service very simply. So that's it for this video. I'd love to know in the comments how you're using MCP, how you're monetizing it. If I missed anything, please let me know. Subscribe if you'd like to see more content like this. Looking forward to your feedback. Thank you.